back to Ask Angelina, but before we get into today's episode, I want to remind you that if you like my podcast, please follow, rate, and share it with your friends and family. As Kamala Harris rises in the polls in this very dramatic 2024 presidential election, the role of female candidates and women's issues such as reproductive rights and women's political autonomy are not new themes in this political sphere. Let's go back in time and learn more about successful suffragettes leading major movements in Australia during the late 19th to mid-20th century. So first of all, what are suffragettes? The word suffragette originates from Great Britain. Suffragette are female advocates who support women's suffrage and fight for equal voting rights. But as historian Nancy Rohr wrote on the Time magazine, this label implied something not genuine, or even to be ridiculed. Women's movements became something less than the real thing, as a small kitchen became a kitchenette. This is pure mockery from men in the late 19th century, as they labeled suffragettes a certain type of woman, who would boldly disrupt meetings and get arrested by the police. This reminds me of Enola Holmes on Netflix, where her missing mother was a suffragette. As I researched more, women played a significant role in Australia's industrial production during World War II, when men were conscripted to the war. With over 200,000 women joining the workforce and roughly 24,000 women entering the army, women received the chance to gain greater service training for jobs over the years. However, after World War II ended, men began to return to their previous jobs, and women became demobilized. Feminists were infuriated by the sudden changes that were accompanied by inequality and harassment towards them. They wanted to increase their political representation and reduce discrimination faced by women. When everyone was listening to the Beatles in the US, Australian women were making much progress in standing up in society through their grassroots feminist movements, street protests, and involvement in the government. In the 1960s and 1970s, Australian feminist protesters were becoming more ambitious in their attempts to change gender stereotypes and gain greater opportunities for women to speak out. This ambition fueled the women's liberation movement, a feminist movement that advocated for women's autonomy. Suffragettes in this Australian women's movement began to be seen as feminist role models and inspired other females to join their movement too. Merle Thornton and Rosalie Bogner were two suffragette leaders who started protesting against the Queensland Liquor Act that banned women from drinking in bars and hotels. At the time, women weren't allowed to buy any type of alcohol drink at the bar. Their most famous act was in 1965, when they chained themselves to a men's-only bar to protest against the ban. This act brought attention to legal discrimination against women in Australian society, and highlighted that everyone has the equal right to enjoy themselves in all activities, even social drinking in bars. Merle Thornton claimed that chaining themselves up to a men's bar created a chain reaction of other feminist acts that ultimately allowed women to have the discretion to do what they chose in this matter. If you had the chance, search up their inspiring act on YouTube and watch their black and white video, and you would be in awe as I was when I watched it. Grassroots feminist movements started to become more prominent in Australia. On March 8, 1975, it was the first time that women rallied for their rights in Melbourne. It was a significant moment in Australians' feminist history because this protest was in a city other than Sydney, and it started to influence other regions in Australia too. It became a milestone event because from every International Women's Day in March onwards, feminist protesters would march for women's rights and free speech. It even carries into the 21st century, as on March 15, 2021, thousands of protesters in Australia attended events for the March for Justice, which was against violence and discrimination against women. They spread the hashtag #EnoughIsEnough via social media as well. These movements all involved marching and occupying public spaces, which created many disruptions for the government. These organized events and movements demonstrated the effectiveness of connecting women together to celebrate and fight for their rights, and also created opportunities for women to speak out, all of which contributed to women's political visibility and representation in Australia. Also, groups of suffragettes started to become more involved in improving policies in the government. Before World War II, there was no elected women representatives in the national parliament. However, the war and electoral reforms helped change the situation. After these movements started to gain more attention, it pressured the government greatly. From 1972 to 1974, feminists created movements to pressure government parties to reform policies on women's rights, healthcare, and even education. In 1972, the Women's Electoral Lobby pressured Australian politicians into adopting policies that were more favorable to women by petitioning, using advertisements, and other means. This lobby attracted many women across Australia to fight for their political rights. Their success reveals that feminist movements could be successful and showed that men could actually support pro-women policies. Men were becoming more conscious of equality, which markedly helped increase their female political representation in Australia. In 1983, the UN created the UN Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And you might have heard me say it before, but this is CEDAW, which I referred to in Episode 3 about Taiwan's progressive approach to gender equality. As the status of women raised globally, this provided women with more opportunities and focused attention on decreasing discrimination, abuse, and unequal pay. Due to many strict policies enforced against women, suffragettes wanted to alter these policies to create a better future for all women to gain equal participation and opportunities as men. Nations even started to recognize issues with their policies. Governments in democratic countries are actually allowing these changes, which does show that Australian women's movements are actually an effective method for going against the government. They successfully pressured and forced the government to add pro-women policies and reforms. In 1994, Australia and other first world countries introduced new policies against domestic violence towards women, which underscores the success of feminist advocacy increasing their political representation. Since there are many different ways for women to show their political representation, many suffragettes came into leadership roles in political parties, eventually changing the institutional bias against women in the government. Janine Haynes became the first woman senator and leader of the Australian Democratic Party in 1986. Other political parties saw Haynes' election as evidence that women could win elections as leaders. Janine Haynes was a figure for other feminists to look up for. And her leadership election reveals how women were starting to increase their political representation in the Australian government. Currently, women occupy 35% of Labour seats in Parliament all over Australia, and 42.9% of positions are held by women in the High Court. The High Court is known for being the highest court of appeal, and this highlights women being able to use their literal power to control the direction of passing women's policies, while also increasing their political representation in the government. So overall, women's political representation and gender equality ultimately improved in Australian society. Although women movements were advancing in many countries at the same time, Australian suffragettes were the main driving force for increasing political representation and pushed to improve gender policies in Australia. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned more about successful suffragettes leading major grassroots movements in Australia. Don't forget to follow, rate, and share this podcast with your friends and family. See you next time. Bye!